Hello class, welcome to lecture 26 of Philosophy 205. In this lecture we continue our discussion of knowledge by looking at the theory of coherentism, which offers a completely different outlook on knowledge from Descartes' foundationalism. The question we're asking is this: does justification turn back on itself? Quine and Julian, who wrote The Web of Belief, the reading for today, claim that justification can go in a circle. Normally we think it's bad if justification is circular. We think there's something wrong with that. So if someone says, I smoke because I'm tense, and I'm tense because I smoke, then that doesn't really explain either why they smoke or why they're tense. It seems like that doesn't explain anything, and so you can't justify anything circularly. But Quine and Julian argue that if you really look at justification as a whole, overall, it does come back on itself. And that is exactly how it should be. So let's take a look at their argument. So first of all, a note about Quine's method. I focus on Quine because Quine is very famous and influential, whereas I don't even know who Julian is. So Quine's method is this. He wants to study successful knowledge generation. He thinks if we want to understand knowledge, the best way to understand it is to look at actual knowledge in the world, rather than just trying to think about it in the abstract. Then once we've identified successful knowledge in the real world, we can discern the methods that people use, and then we can discover what actually leads to knowledge. So his idea was there is knowledge in the world. He takes that as the starting point. And he says if we look at actual knowledge that exists and take a look at the structure of it, how the beliefs relate to one another when they're forming knowledge, we can eventually discover what knowledge is all about. And for Quine, the paradigm example of knowledge is science. So to a large extent, Quine looks to science to discover what methods scientists use to gain knowledge as the paradigm for what knowledge is. So this is a very different outlook from Descartes. Descartes thought we need to ignore the existence of the external world and we need to focus entirely on our own minds and try to prove that the external world exists. And only then can we claim to have knowledge about the external world. Quine has a completely different starting point. He says it's obvious that we do know about the world. So we can just look at the knowledge that we have, and that's the way we figure out where knowledge comes from. Now there's an issue we run into once we start looking at actual examples of knowledge. The point here is almost all of our knowledge is based on observation. And much of our other knowledge is gained using logic. But there's an interesting relationship between observation and logic. So first of all, it's sentences that stand in logical relations. So go back to our unit on logic. In logic, we say an argument is a set of sentences, and an argument is valid if, assuming the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So it's sentences that stand in logical relations. Logic is all about which sentences imply which other sentences. Another important thing about logic is sensations don't stand in logical relations. So when you're doing logic, you don't have a sensation and then therefore there is a cat on the table. That's not part of logic. A sensation is something else. But somehow observations are crucial for knowledge. Somehow observations are important in justifying our beliefs. So very often when people think about justification, they think about offering a justification. So the paradigm case of justification is you say, I know that the store opens at 8 o'clock. And then someone says, oh yeah, how do you know that? And then you explain how you know that. And when you explain it, you offer some kind of argument. And so that's normally what people think of when they think of justification. And yet that justification relies on sentences, making statements. It's a relation among propositions. it's not sensations. You can't just like send a sensation to somebody to explain what you're talking about. So how can observations justify other beliefs when they don't stand in logical relations? They don't imply anything. Just as the fact that a rock by itself doesn't imply anything, how can sensations? So the first step when Quine is applying this method is to identify what he calls observation sentences. So he notices the importance of observation in generating knowledge in the real world. He notes this problem about observations and logic. So he says what we really need to focus on is observation sentences. It's not the sensation themselves that are important. It's not the experience in your mind. It's the sentence that results. And so what is an observation sentence? An observation sentence is a description of an observable. And Quine says that what distinguishes observation sentences from other kinds of sentences is observers who know the language will agree to observation sentences. So a clear example is if we both speak English and we're both standing in front of a table, and I say, that's a table. If you understand the language, you're going to agree with me, because the table will be right there in front of us. It'll be obvious that it's a table. Everyone will agree. So according to Quine, that's what makes something an observation sentence. It's the kind of thing that you know to be true just by being in the right conditions and understanding the language. Let's take a look at some examples to clarify exactly what he means. What is an observation sentence and what isn't? So first of all, a dog is chewing a stick. That is an observation sentence. So anyone who knows what all these words means will know that this sentence is true. Furthermore, a child is holding ice cream. Once again, if you know what all the words mean, you know that that sentence is true. If we're both standing there looking at the same scene, we'll come to the same conclusion. However, the following is not an observation sentence. So if we say Susan is coming back from Coldstone, even if that's true, just looking at this scene, you might not know that this is Susan. And even if you know what Coldstone is, you have no way of knowing that this is from Coldstone. So even if this is true, observe and you know the language, you know what all the words mean, you won't be able to tell whether this is true. So this one is not an observation sentence. So that's the difference between an observation sentence and one that isn't. An observation sentence, all you need to know is what the words mean, and just by being in that situation, you can tell that it's true. Whereas other things are not observation. So you don't know that that's Susan just by looking at the scene. All right. And so there are similar things like this rock is 4 billion years old. Even if that's true, you wouldn't be able to tell that just by looking at a rock. So that's not an observation sentence. That's something you'd have to discover through other means. Whereas this is a rock would be an observation sentence. Okay. And so for Quine, these are not foundational beliefs, but they do play a very important role in generating knowledge. And we'll see how that works in a moment. We'll see it's very different from the role that Descartes assigned to his foundational beliefs. These are not foundational beliefs. But we get to that. Just note that this is very focused on the external world. So when you think about the observation sentences we've been describing, these observations are primarily about the external world. They're not about our own minds. There are sentences about dogs and sticks, about rocks, about tables, about ice cream. These are all things that are happening in the world around us. They are not primarily about our own mental states. When you make an observation, when you describe what you're observing, you normally don't describe the experience. So past philosophers who were inspired by Descartes tried to take all knowledge back to knowledge of our own mental states. Like there's a patch of red in this area of my visual field and a patch of blue in this area of my visual field. But what Quine and others pointed out is we never describe anything in those terms. That's never the way we express what we're observing. We aren't focused on our mental states. We're focused on the world. And by taking this as a starting point, it avoids certain objections to Descartes. So one of the main objections to Descartes was that his foundations didn't include enough to get knowledge of the external world, because Descartes said we needed to start from knowledge of our own mental states. The problem was our mental states aren't the world. And so how can we get from our own mind to the world? Quine doesn't have this problem. We're starting with observations of the world. Of course, you might question whether that's legitimate, whether he's screwing something up here, but it at least does avoid this objection in that way. Another thing to note, observations depend on theories. So for example, persistence theory. You might not think of this as a theory. It's something that we assume. It's so basic to everything we ever deal with, to every observation we ever make, to every thought we ever have. But it really is a theory that we bring to the table, an assumption that we make about the world. And so the fact is, persistence is not observed. By persistence, I mean the existence of a single object over time. You don't directly observe that this is the same object as that thing I was looking at 2 seconds ago. But we accept the theory that objects persist. We accept that if things look the same to us, that's because there are objects in the world that exist across time and they aren't changing. But this is something that we need to learn. If you look at child psychology, very young children, infants, don't yet understand that objects persist over time. They don't realize that objects are still there when you're not looking at them, for example. But this is a theory that we assume when we're dealing with objects in the everyday world. Now think about how basic this is to everything you think. So the very idea that things still exist when you're not looking at them is important for leaving something somewhere, for the idea that there is a store you can get to, the idea that campus will be there, the idea that there's a meeting tomorrow, the idea that there's class, the idea that you have a computer, that you have a book, that you can go get a pencil. Pretty much everything you ever do is based on the belief in this theory that objects persist over time, that something doesn't simply go out of existence when you're not looking at it. But that is a theory about the world. It's one that's very well justified, but it's still a theory. And so why is that important? So according to Quine, this reveals something important about the nature of knowledge. So let's think about what happens when our beliefs change, specifically when they change based on observation. So what happens is, when beliefs change based on observation, that means we come to accept a new observation sentence. So before we didn't believe there's a cat on the table, now we're looking at a cat on the table, and now we think, oh, there's a cat on the table. And so that's how we describe the scene. And then we note the logical relations to our other beliefs. So if we previously believed there are no animals on the table, now we look, see there's a cat on the table, now we have to revise our previous beliefs. And the way to do that is we have to change our previous beliefs to maintain coherence. If we previously thought there are no animals on the table, now we're looking at the table and we're thinking there's a cat on the table. We notice that means that there is an animal on the table. So our previous belief that there were no animals on the table has to be rejected. We have to change our beliefs based on this new observation. But what is the goal? The goal is coherence. So what you're faced with when you make an observation that conflicts with the beliefs you already have is you're faced with an inconsistent set of beliefs. So you come to the scene believing there's no animal. Based on your observation, you start believing there is a cat on the table. Now, your beliefs are not coherent. The problem is, incoherent beliefs can't all be true. The new beliefs conflict with the old beliefs. And so this implies that you must change some of your beliefs. But here's the interesting question. Which ones? In the example that I gave, where you observe a cat on the table, you'll almost certainly give up the belief that there's no animal on the table. In that case, your observation is strong enough to overrule your previous belief that there's no animal on the table, which was probably just based on assumptions about usually there isn't an animal on the table. But that's not always the right way to go. One of the most important points that Quine and Ullien make in Web of Belief is that there are always multiple ways you can resolve incoherence. Incoherence just means you have beliefs that conflict with one another. It doesn't automatically tell you which one has to go. Incoherence means your beliefs can't all be true, but it doesn't tell you which ones are the wrong ones and which ones are right. So there's room to maybe reject one belief or maybe reject another. And that's where we start getting into the core of coherentism. So the method of revising beliefs, according to coherentism, goes like this. You try to accommodate observations. Observations are still important. Generally, what we think we see is worth believing. But we're trying to maintain maximum coherence. The overall goal is to maintain a coherent set of beliefs. So as new observations come in, it's usually important to adapt your beliefs to be consistent with your observations. But every once in a while, it'll require a different change. All right, so we're maintaining maximum coherence. We keep what works and drop what doesn't. So let's just get an example of how this would go. So for example, you think John can't swim, but then you see him swim. At that point, you have to rethink your beliefs. Now the next step, and this is very important, I've been hinting at it already, but according to coherentism, there are no privileged beliefs. If we go back to Descartes, Descartes said beliefs about your own mind have a privileged status. Those beliefs can't be doubted. They're the foundation. Everything else is based on them. Coherentism utterly rejects that. Coherentism says no belief is inherently better than any other. There isn't any class of belief that is immune to change. And so, sure, observation beliefs tend to be strong, but even they can be rejected. What we have to do is consult the overall system. Again, the goal in coherentism is to maintain an overall coherent system of beliefs. What you don't want is to have some beliefs that don't fit with your other beliefs. That shows that there's something wrong with your way of thinking. If you get a bunch of observations and then you believe a bunch of theories, and the theories you believe don't fit with your observations, there's something wrong with your beliefs. So you have to have an overall coherent system. But for the purpose of finding the best coherent system, there isn't any belief that's completely immune to change. Everything is up for question. So just to give one classic example, illusions. In cases of illusions, what you would be inclined to say based on observation turns out to be false. You later get information that leads you to reject it. So for example, here's a scene from the movie Labyrinth. So when you first see this looks like a sculpture. Looks like a sculpture of David Bowie's face. But right as Hoggle moves out of the frame, you can see that it's actually several different rocks at different distances from the camera that, based on clever perspective from one particular angle, look like David Bowie's face. But they're actually not even touching each other. They're at a bunch of different distances, a bunch of different sizes. It's not actually a sculpture. So when you first see this scene, your observation would be there's a sculpture of a face. But then based on more information, you can end up rejecting that previous observation. So here we have a case where an observation sentence can be rejected. Even though most of our knowledge about the world is based on observation, that doesn't mean observations have some special status. They can be revised as well. Furthermore, theories are important in our overall system of beliefs. Think about persistence theory. Sometimes it might look like an object goes out of existence, but because we believe that objects persist over time, we will usually reject those appearances. We won't think, oh, that just stopped existing suddenly. And that's because we have so much reason to believe that objects persist over time that even when it looks like they don't, we have reason to reject the way things look. And so for theories, there are a lot of relevant considerations when we're trying to figure out whether to accept a theory or reject it, especially when there are observations that conflict with theories. So when we consider whether to accept a theory, one thing we do is test its predictions. We test its usefulness. We test the explanations that it gives. And we compare it to observations and compare it to competing theories. So the way we form beliefs, according to coherentism, is we propose new beliefs all the time. And then we test how those beliefs fit with everything else. So when we're testing predictions, we draw conclusions from the theory. We say, if this theory is true, then this other thing must be true. Then we make an observation and see, does the observation conflict with the theory? And then once again, if there's a conflict, we have to resolve that. Our beliefs are incoherent when there's conflict, so we have to revise one of them. If the observation is strong enough, we'll have to revise the theory. If we have enough reason to believe the theory, we might reject the observation and say, we didn't really see what we think we saw. Furthermore, we test usefulness. We can use theories to do things. We can apply theories. And if we find a lot of ways to apply a theory, that gives us more reason to hold on to it. If there's a theory that can be successfully applied in a lot of fields, it doesn't make sense to reject it. One example of this is psychology. Some philosophers argue that psychology has no basis and that we should reject psychology. But one of the strongest arguments against that is we're able to use psychology to do a lot of important things, to make a lot of important progress. And so there's no reason to reject it based on these philosophical considerations when it's doing good work. And also we want to compare it to observations and competing theories. So sometimes if a theory is the only possible theory we can think of, and we have a lot of evidence to back it up, that might give us reason to reject certain outlying observations as somehow flawed. Right. So let's take a look at the example of oxygen and phlogiston. If you're not familiar with phlogiston theory is an outdated theory of combustion, and it looked something like this. According to phlogiston theory, flammable objects such as wood were rich in phlogiston. And the theory also said if you heat up an object that's full of phlogiston, the phlogiston will rush out of the object, and that's what combustion is, that's what fire is. And the result is an object with all the phlogiston gone, that's what ashes are, and then the phlogiston goes up into the air, so that's what's in smoke. That was the theory. Now it turns out this theory was very successful. They were able to make a lot of predictions with this theory. It explained a lot of different phenomena. They were able to explain not just fire, but also rust and other things. So it was a pretty useful theory. It had a lot of value for them at the time. And there might be some observations that they couldn't make sense of using phlogiston theory, but at the time, there was no better alternative, and this did a good job making their beliefs coherent, believing that there was this substance, phlogiston, in flammable objects that could be released. But then came along oxygen theory. Antoine Lavoisier performed some experiments that showed that what happens in combustion is not phlogiston being released. It's a different reaction. There's oxygen in the air. And it's the reaction of the oxygen in the air with the flammable object when heat is applied that causes fire. And the way he showed this was to perform brand new experiments that nobody had ever done, whose results could only be explained by there being something in the air that was combining with the burning substance. And so once you have those observations that are so clearly explained by oxygen in the air rather than something rushing out of the burning substance, then you have to get rid of the old theory. And so even though the old theory did a lot of good work, here comes a better one. Here comes new observations that can be explained by something else. And so once we have that new evidence, the new evidence is incoherent with phlogiston theory, but it is coherent with oxygen theory. To maintain the best overall coherent system, it's better to reject phlogiston theory and adopt the new oxygen theory rather than just trying to reject our observations. If there are too many observations that are too consistent, that are easily explained by a theory, what we should do is adopt the theory rather than reject the explanations. So overall, what we end up with, according to coherentism, the beliefs face the tribunal of observation not singly, but in a body. So here we finally have the explanation of justification of belief according to coherentism. Basically, coherentism says that a single belief by itself is not justified. What's justified is your entire system of beliefs. Your entire system of beliefs is justified by being coherent. And experience does play an important role. It's out there on the edge, basically keeping everything honest, but it's not privileged. It doesn't have some special status. And so this is the theory of coherentism. That what it really means to be justified is for your entire body of beliefs to be coherent. So once again, this is very, very different from Descartes. Descartes said, you've got to start with these beliefs that are completely certain and then build up from there. And each of the foundational beliefs on its own could be justified. Whereas coherentism says, if you just have one belief, you don't know whether that one belief is justified. What you have to do is see how it fits in with literally everything else you believe. Now, one of the issues is you never know what evidence might be relevant to what other belief. Any belief you have could be relevant to any other belief. All right. Now, one other interesting thing to point out about this idea is what's here in the middle. So beliefs based on experience are out here on the edge, and they can come at you fast and change a lot. So what you're experiencing changes from moment to moment. And so that might lead you to revise a lot of these beliefs out towards the edge very frequently. So you might frequently have to adapt your beliefs about, well, what kind of person is my friend? You might observe him doing things you didn't expect him to do. And so those kind of things will change a lot. But in the middle, there are going to be beliefs about math and logic. So beliefs about math and logic are pretty universal. They apply to pretty much everything. But according to coherentists, it's at least possible that if we have enough experience that conflicts with mathematical beliefs, we could have reason to reject our previously held mathematical beliefs. So once again, experience doesn't have a special status. Logic doesn't have a special status. It's all about how it fits together. If it turns out that math stops fitting together, that basic math, 2 + 2 = 4, stops fitting together with all of our other beliefs, then at that point, the right thing to do would be to reject the belief that 2 + 2 = 4. Now that doesn't seem likely, but according to coherentists, we need to be open to that possibility. There's nothing special about math. It just turns out that right now, it's extremely coherent with everything we do everywhere, and so it's very strongly justified by fitting together so well with everything we believe. But it could change. So I'll end with this. So what is knowledge according to coherentism? So this is what coherentists say. Coherentism. According to coherentism, knowledge is true belief that is part of a coherent belief system. So that's all it takes. Now, what are some reasons to think this is a good theory? What are some reasons to think it's bad? Well, reasons to think it's good are, as we've seen, it allows you to have knowledge about the external world, because our observation beliefs about the world do fit with our beliefs about general theories. So we don't have to worry that there's technically a way we could be wrong. It doesn't matter that we could technically be wrong in some abstract sense. What matters is our beliefs fit together. Our observations fit with our beliefs. That is one benefit. Another benefit is this does seem to be closer to how we operate in the real world. In the real world, we don't start by thinking about our own mental states and then build up from there. In the real world, we have a bunch of beliefs that we start with, we make some observations, and then we compare them to each other and see which ones to accept and which to reject. So it seems to fit better with what we actually do, and it seems like it allows for knowledge of the real world. But there is one problem. One problem is this says that you know something if it's part of a coherent belief system. The trouble is, it seems like there could be a lot of different coherent systems that don't necessarily have any connection to the world. So think about any well-imagined fictional universe. So something in science fiction or fantasy. You can come up with a coherent description of a world or universe that's completely different from ours. And as long as the story is very consistent, that would be a coherent system of beliefs. But that doesn't seem like it could be a basis for knowledge. So coherentism would say, as long as that belief system is coherent, then the beliefs in that system that happen to be true count as knowledge, and that seems weird. If you have some consistent theory about living in the Harry Potter universe, though I don't know how coherent the Harry Potter universe is, but let's say it is coherent. That if someone very consistently believes they're in the Harry Potter universe, then the things they believe that happen to be true, such as that King's Cross Station exists, then those will be knowledge. And that doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem like believing you're in a fictional universe could be the basis for knowledge. All right, so this does do some things we wanted knowledge to do, but it seems to fall short on some others. So what do you think? Is this a good theory of knowledge, or do we need to go looking for something else? Well, we'll think about this more in the next lecture.